She found a key in her father's coat. It opened an equipment shed no one knew existed. What she discovered inside wasn't just about a forgotten piece of property. It was about a past that had been deliberately buried and a future she never knew she had the right to claim. If you've ever felt like your story was written for you by someone else, then I need you to listen to this. Hit that subscribe button because we're going to unpack this together, and I promise it's a journey worth taking. The day I turned 18 was the day I was officially released. Not from a prison with bars, but from one with paperwork and sympathetic, tired eyes. The state of California had been my legal guardian for 2 years, ever since my father died and the world fell out from under me. My release came in the form of a final meeting with my caseworker, a woman named Sharon whose smile never quite reached the corners of her perpetually worried expression. We sat in her beige office, a room that smelled faintly of stale coffee and disinfectant. The air was thick with the silent hum of bureaucracy. She slid a cardboard box across the desk. It was a standard issue file box, sealed with yellowing tape. "These are your father's personal effects," she said, her voice gentle, practiced. "The ones that were recovered from the apartment. We've held them for you." I stared at the box. 2 years. 2 years of living in a group home, of learning to make myself small, of answering questions about my progress and my emotional state. 2 years of grieving in scheduled, 30-minute increments with a state-appointed therapist. All that time, a part of my father had been sitting in a storage room somewhere, waiting for me to become an adult. I didn't reach for it. My hands felt heavy, pinned to my lap. "Okay," I said. It was the only word I could manage. Sharon gave me another one of her sad smiles and then went through the final checklist. A debit card with a meager sum of transitional funds, a list of resources for low-income housing, a pamphlet on job seeking. It was the official off-ramp from the system, a polite way of saying, "You're on your own now." The whole exchange felt like a transaction. My childhood, for a box of ghosts and a list of phone numbers. I remember the odd, subtle humor in it. The state raises you just enough to legally wash its hands of you. There's a quiet absurdity to it that you can only really appreciate when you're the one being handed the paperwork. I signed the last form, my signature shaky. My name, Maya Easton, looked foreign on the page. I was officially no one's ward. I was just me. Whatever that was supposed to mean. I took the box. It was heavier than I expected. My new apartment was what they call a transitional living unit. It was a single room on the 3rd floor of a concrete building that overlooked a freeway. The sound of traffic was a constant, rushing roar, a river of noise that never stopped. The room was furnished with a metal frame bed, a small table, and a single chair. It was clean, sterile, and utterly devoid of personality. It felt less like a home and more like a holding cell between one life and the next. For the first few hours, I just sat on the edge of the bed, the box at my feet. The sun set, casting long, orange stripes across the gray walls. I was afraid to open it. Afraid of what I would find and what I wouldn't. Afraid that the contents would be so meager, so meaningless, that they would just confirm the story I'd been telling myself for 2 years, that my father's life had shrunk to almost nothing by the end. That he had left me with nothing. Finally, when the room was nearly dark, I took a breath, broke the tape, and opened the box. The contents were sparse. A worn leather wallet, empty except for his driver's license. The photo was from years ago, before my mom died, before the light in his eyes had dimmed. He was smiling, a real smile, the kind that crinkled the skin around his eyes. I traced the outline of his face with my finger, a lump forming in my throat. There was a cheap watch with a cracked face, its hands frozen at 3:17. A paperback novel, its spine broken. And at the bottom, folded neatly, was his old canvas work coat. It was a faded olive green, stained with grease and something that looked like rust. It smelled of him. A faint, complex scent of sawdust, motor oil, and cold mountain air. I buried my face in it, and for the first time in 2 years, I cried. Not the quiet, controlled tears of my therapy sessions, but a raw, gut-wrenching sob that shook my whole body. I cried for the man who taught me how to tie my shoes. I cried for the man who read me stories at night. I cried for the broken man he became, the one who drank to forget, the one who I couldn't save. I cried until I was empty, hollowed out, the roar of the freeway filling the silence. After, I just held the coat in my lap, its rough fabric a strange comfort. My fingers, numb and clumsy, moved over the material, tracing the seams, the pockets. And that's when I felt it. A small, hard lump sewn into the lining of the collar, right at the back of the neck. It was deliberate, hidden. My heart started to beat a little faster. Using my thumbnail, I carefully picked at the thick threads until they loosened. I pulled the object out. It was a key. It was old, made of heavy, dark metal, with a simple, almost skeletal design. It wasn't a house key or a car key. It looked agricultural, industrial, like it belonged to a tractor or a heavy gate. There was a small, tarnished brass tag attached to it by a thin wire, but the letters had been worn almost smooth. I held it up to the dim light, tilting it back and forth. I could just make out a single letter and a number, F-17. It meant nothing to me. I put the key on the table and continued emptying the box. Under the coat was a thick manila envelope. My name was written on the front in my father's familiar, blocky handwriting. My breath caught. This was different. This wasn't just an object. It was a message. But inside, it wasn't a letter from him. It was a stack of official documents, legal papers, property deeds, and a sheaf of letters from a company called Ridgeback Development Corporation. I spread them out on the floor. My father had owned a small piece of land, a 5-acre plot with a house and a barn up in the Sierra foothills. I vaguely remembered it from when I was very young, a place of tall grass and the smell of pine needles. We'd left after my mom got sick, moving to the city for her treatments. I thought he'd sold it years ago. According to the deed, he never had. It was in his name. And now, according to a letter from a probate lawyer, it was in mine. The relief that flared in me was instantly extinguished by the other letters, the ones from Ridgeback Development. They were offers to buy the property. The first one was dated a week after my father's death. The offer was low, but it was something. The second, a few months later, was slightly higher. The most recent one, dated last week, was different. It wasn't an offer. It was a warning. It spoke of outstanding debts, property tax liens, and a foreclosure notice. It said my father had used the property as collateral on a series of loans he'd defaulted on. The debt was staggering. Ridgeback had apparently bought the debt from the original lenders. They were now offering to buy the property from me for the exact amount of the alleged debt, framing it as a generous offer to liberate me from a significant financial burden. I had 30 days to accept, or they would proceed with foreclosure and I would get nothing. The room felt cold. The single window showed a slice of black sky, streaked with the headlights of passing cars. Nothing. He had left me with nothing but a mountain of debt and a choice between 0 and 0. The story I'd told myself seemed to be the right one after all. The key on the table seemed to mock me, a key to nothing. A final, cruel joke from a man who had checked out long before he died. I picked up the phone and dialed the number for Mr. Evans, a legal aid lawyer whose card Sharon had given me. His voice was calm, measured, as I explained the situation. He was quiet for a long time after I finished. "Maya," he said finally, his tone gentle but firm. "I've seen this before. These development companies, they can be aggressive. They buy up debt on distressed properties, properties owned by people who are vulnerable. They use it as leverage," he sighed. "Frankly, their offer to take it for the debt amount is probably the best you're going to get. Fighting it would cost money you don't have, and if the debt is legitimate, you'd lose anyway. You'd be left with the debt and no property." He paused. "My advice? Sign the papers, take the fresh start. Don't get tangled up in this." A fresh start. The words echoed in the sterile room. It sounded like giving up. It sounded like letting them win. I looked at the old, heavy key on the table. F-17. It was a question without an answer. I thanked Mr. Evans and hung up. I sat in the dark, the roar of the freeway filling my ears. A fresh start. But what if it meant erasing the last piece of my father? The last piece of my history? I had 30 days. 30 days to decide whether to let my past be paved over, or to find a lock that fit this strange, stubborn key. The next morning, I bought a bus ticket. The decision felt less like a choice and more like a compulsion, an invisible string pulling me north. Mr. Evans's practical advice echoed in my head. Sign the papers, take the fresh start. But every time I thought about it, my stomach twisted. It felt like a betrayal, not just of my father, but of the little girl who remembered a field of wildflowers and the safety of her father's hand. Signing those papers without ever seeing the place again felt like agreeing that those memories were worthless, that he was worthless. I packed a small bag with a change of clothes, the packet of documents, and the coat. I slipped the heavy key into my pocket, its weight a solid, grounding presence. The bus station was a chaotic swirl of arrivals and departures, people running toward new lives or away from old ones. I felt like I was doing both. I found my seat by a grimy window and watched the city fall away behind me. The concrete towers and sprawling suburbs gradually gave way to farmland, then to rolling hills dotted with oak trees. The further the bus traveled, the more the knot in my chest seemed to loosen. The constant hum of the city was replaced by the drone of the engine and the rhythmic thump of the tires on the pavement. For the first time in 2 years, I felt like I was moving toward something, instead of just being moved around by others. The system had dictated my life for so long, where I slept, what I ate, who I talked to. This journey, this impulsive, illogical trip, was the first real decision I had made as an adult. It was terrifying, and it was liberating. The other passengers were a quiet, transient community. A young mother trying to soothe a crying baby, an old man staring out the window with vacant eyes, a group of farm workers speaking in quiet, rapid Spanish. We were all suspended between places, our stories temporarily shelved. I leaned my head against the cool glass of the window. I thought about my father. I tried to remember him before the sadness took over. I remembered him teaching me how to skip stones on the river near our old house. He had a way of finding the perfect flat ones, and his would bounce 5, 6, 7 times before sinking. Mine would just thud into the water. He never got impatient. He'd just find another stone and say, "Watch the wrist, Maya, it's all in the wrist." I remembered the smell of his workshop, the real one behind our old house, filled with half-finished projects and the sweet scent of cut pine. He could fix anything. A broken chair, a sputtering lawnmower, my favorite doll whose arm had come off. He would hold the broken pieces in his large, calloused hands with such concentration, as if the fate of the world depended on it. Where did that man go? The bus climbed higher into the foothills. The air grew thinner, cleaner. Pine trees began to replace the oaks, their dark green shapes stark against the pale sky. The weather was turning. The sky, which had been a clear, bright blue when I left the city, was now bruised with dark, heavy clouds. A cold wind rattled the windows of the bus. It felt like the landscape was bracing itself for something. By the time the bus pulled into the small town of North Fork, a light, persistent drizzle had begun. The town was little more than a main street with a gas station, a general store, and a diner with a flickering neon sign. It felt like a place forgotten by time. The bus driver called out the stop, and I was the only one who got off. He gave me a curious look as he handed me my bag. "Not much out here for a young person," he said, not unkindly. "You sure this is your stop?" "I'm sure," I said, pulling the collar of my father's coat up against the wind. The bus pulled away with a hiss of its air brakes, leaving me alone in the growing dusk. The property was another 2 miles out of town. The address was on the deed. I could have called for a taxi, if there was such a thing in a town this small, but I wanted to walk. I needed to feel the ground under my feet, to arrive on my own terms. The rain was coming down harder now, cold and sharp. It soaked through my jeans and plastered my hair to my face. The road was narrow and winding, slick with wet leaves. The air smelled of wet earth and pine. It was a lonely walk. The few houses I passed were set far back from the road, their lights small and distant beacons in the gloom. I felt a rising sense of dread. What was I even doing here? I was chasing a memory, a feeling, armed with a key that probably opened nothing of importance. Mr. Evans was right. I should have stayed in the city, signed the papers, and tried to forget. But I kept walking. My father's coat was heavy with rain, but it felt like a shield. With each step, I felt like I was walking back in time, toward a part of myself I had locked away. The part that existed before caseworkers and group homes, the part that belonged to him. Finally, I saw it. A rusted wrought iron gate, half swallowed by overgrown blackberry bushes. A faded wooden sign hung from one hinge, the words Easton Place barely legible. This was it. I pushed the gate open. It groaned in protest, the sound loud in the quiet of the falling rain. The driveway was a muddy track, flanked by a chaotic jungle of weeds and saplings. And at the end of it, I saw the house. It was a silhouette against the bruised purple sky, a dark, wounded shape. And my heart sank. The house was in worse shape than I could have ever imagined. It wasn't just neglected, it was collapsing. The front porch sagged dangerously to one side, its roof buckled. Paint peeled from the clapboard siding in long, curling strips, revealing the weathered gray wood beneath. Several windows were boarded up, others were just dark, gaping holes. The yard was a battlefield of nature reclaiming its territory. Weeds grew as high as my waist, and what was once a lawn was now a tangled mat of brown grass and thorny vines. The rain dripped from the eaves in a sad, irregular rhythm. It looked like the kind of place people tell ghost stories about. My hopeful, fragile fantasy of finding some hidden gem, some cozy cottage waiting to be revived, shattered against the brutal reality of the decay. This wasn't a home. It was a ruin. I stood there in the mud and the rain, the cold seeping into my bones. This was what he'd left me. A pile of rotting wood and a mountain of debt. The anger I'd felt in my apartment came rushing back, hot and sharp. How could he have let it get like this? How could he have abandoned this place and me so completely? I took a deep breath, the damp air burning my lungs, and forced myself to move. I climbed the rickety steps to the porch, testing each one before putting my full weight on it. The front door was locked, its wood swollen and warped. I peered through a grimy window into the front room. It was dark and filled with ghostly shapes draped in white cloths. Furniture. He hadn't even bothered to sell it. It was all just left here to rot. I walked around the side of the house, my boots sinking into the soft mud. The back door was also locked. I tried the key from my pocket, the heavy, skeletal key, on both doors, knowing it was useless. The key was too big, too industrial. It didn't fit. Of course it didn't. Disappointment, sharp and bitter, soured in my stomach. I slid down the wall, my back against the damp siding, and just sat there in the mud as the rain fell around me. What a fool I was. I'd come all this way on a stupid, childish whim, chasing a ghost. There was nothing here for me. Nothing but decay. I should just go back to town, call Mr. Evans, and tell him to send the papers. Let Ridgeback Development have it. Let them bulldoze it into the ground. Maybe it was better that way. I don't know how long I sat there, letting the cold and the misery wash over me. But as the last of the light faded from the sky, something shifted. A memory, faint and fleeting, surfaced from the deep well of my childhood. A hot summer day. Me, maybe 5 or 6 years old, chasing grasshoppers in the tall grass behind the barn. My father is working on something nearby, the rhythmic sound of a hammer echoing in the warm air. I wander too far, into the thicket of trees and vines at the edge of the property. I get tangled in blackberry thorns, and I start to cry. He comes for me. He carefully untangles my shirt and my hair, his big hands surprisingly gentle. "You gotta be careful back here, little bird," he says, his voice soft. "Lots of hidden things in these woods." Hidden things. The phrase echoed in my mind. I got to my feet, my body stiff and cold. The barn. I hadn't even looked at the barn. It stood about 50 yards from the house, a large, classic shape with a gambrel roof, its red paint faded to a soft, dusty rose. It seemed to be in slightly better shape than the house, more solid, more defiant against the years of neglect. I trudged through the wet grass toward it. The huge sliding doors were chained and padlocked. A modern, heavy-duty lock. Not the kind my old key would fit. I peered through a crack in the doors. The inside was cavernous and dark, filled with the hulking shapes of old farm equipment and stacks of lumber. It smelled of hay and dust and time. I walked the perimeter of the barn, running my hand along the weathered wood. The rain had softened to a fine mist. The world was quiet except for the dripping of water from the roof. On the far side of the barn, the side that faced the dense woods bordering the property, the vegetation was thickest. A wall of ivy, its leaves dark and glossy with rain, covered the entire lower half of the structure. It was beautiful, in a wild, untamed way. I was about to turn back when I saw it. A faint, almost imperceptible line in the thick curtain of ivy. A vertical seam. My heart gave a small, hopeful leap. I pushed through the wet leaves, pulling at the thick, woody vines. They were tough, deeply rooted, but I tore at them with a desperate energy. And as I pulled a large section of ivy away, I revealed it. A door. A small, man-sized door, set flush into the wall of the barn, almost perfectly concealed. It had no handle, only a keyhole, dark and grim, and below the keyhole, a small, tarnished brass plate, almost the same as the tag on my key. It was stamped with the same characters, F-17. I stopped, my breath hitched. My hand went to my pocket and I pulled out the key. It felt warm against my cold skin. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely fit the key into the lock. It slid in with a smooth, satisfying click. I turned it. The lock mechanism, stiff from years of disuse, resisted for a moment, and then gave way with a deep, resonant thud that seemed to come from the very bones of the building. I pulled the door open. It swung inward into absolute darkness, releasing a rush of stale, cold air that smelled of concrete and oil and something else. Something clean and chemical. This wasn't part of the barn. It was something else entirely. It was the shed no one knew existed. The darkness inside the shed was absolute. It was a thick, palpable blackness that swallowed the faint gray light of the evening. The air that flowed out was cold and still, carrying a scent that was jarringly different from the damp earth and decay outside. It was the sterile smell of a sealed place, with undertones of metal, solvent, and dry paper. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the sudden silence. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers clumsy with cold and anticipation. I turned on the flashlight, and the narrow beam cut a sharp white cone into the darkness. I stepped inside. The door swung shut behind me with a heavy, final-sounding click, plunging me back into darkness for a second before I could steady the light. The space was small, no bigger than a walk-in closet, with concrete walls and a smooth concrete floor. It was meticulous. Unlike the chaotic ruin of the house and the dusty clutter of the barn, this place was ordered, clean, and deliberate. A long, sturdy workbench ran along the far wall, its surface wiped clean except for a single object. On the walls, instead of farm tools, were shelves filled with neatly labeled binders and file boxes. There were maps pinned to a corkboard, intricate topographical maps of the surrounding area, marked with colored pins and handwritten notes. This wasn't a farm shed, it was an office, a command center, a secret. My light beam moved across the shelves. The labels on the binders read, well water assays, soil composition reports, geological surveys. The file boxes were labeled with years, Ridgeback Comms 2016, County Planning Department 2017, EP of violations. It was a library of information about this land and the people who wanted it. A cold dread mixed with a dizzying sense of discovery washed over me. This was what my father was doing. It wasn't that he was letting the place fall apart out of neglect. He was studying it. He was fighting for it. My light finally came to rest on the workbench. The single object sitting in the center was a metal lockbox, the kind used for petty cash, painted a drab gray. It looked solid, important. There was no keyhole, just a simple latch. I lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of yellowed foam padding, were two things. The first was a thick, sealed envelope made of heavy vellum. My name, Maya, was written across the front in my father's strong, familiar script. The second was a small, black microcassette recorder, the kind journalists used to use, with a single tape inside. I sank onto a small wooden stool tucked under the workbench, my legs suddenly too weak to hold me. The concrete room was cold, but I barely felt it. I felt like I was on the verge of a precipice, about to look down into a chasm that would change my entire understanding of the world. For 2 years, I had believed a simple, tragic story. A good man is broken by grief, turns to alcohol, and lets his life, his property, and his daughter drift away. It was a sad story, but it was a story that made sense. What these binders and maps suggested was something else entirely. Something more complex and more dangerous. My hands trembled as I picked up the envelope. I broke the seal. Inside were 10 pages, front and back, covered in his handwriting. I took a deep breath and began to read. My dearest Maya, the letter began. If you are reading this, it means I'm gone. It means that for all my planning, I wasn't able to finish what I started. And it means you found your way back here. I'm sorry. I am so sorry for all of it. For leaving you alone, for the past 2 years, for the story you've probably been told and have come to believe. I need you to know that story isn't true. My eyes filled with tears, blurring the words. I wiped them away, forcing myself to focus. I didn't lose myself in a bottle, little bird. I used it. It was a cover. After your mother died, I wanted to sell this place and just disappear. The memories were too loud. But when the offers started coming in, they were too aggressive, too eager. It was a company called Ridgeback. They didn't just want the land, they needed it. I started digging. I'm a handyman, Maya, not a detective. But I know how to look at how things are put together. And their story didn't fit right. He went on to explain. He'd used his skills to get contract work on some of Ridgeback's other local projects, posing as a drifting alcoholic, a man no one would look at twice. He listened. He watched. He discovered their secret. Ridgeback wasn't just a development company. They were a front for a waste disposal corporation from out of state. The soil and water reports on the shelves around me were the ones he'd secretly commissioned. They showed that the groundwater on the properties Ridgeback had already acquired was heavily contaminated with industrial toxins. They weren't building resorts. They were creating a toxic dumping ground, slowly and secretly poisoning the entire aquifer that the town of North Fork and the surrounding farms relied on. This land, our land, he wrote, is different. It sits directly over the primary source of the aquifer. The geological surveys I had done show there's a massive underground cavern system right beneath this property. To control this land is to control the entire water table for this valley. They don't want to build on it. They want to drill into it and use it as their main disposal site. It would be an environmental catastrophe, and they could hide it for years. The loans, the debt, it was all a sham. Ridgeback had bought out a small local credit union and fabricated a series of loans against his property. They had created a paper trail of debt to force him out, to make the foreclosure look legitimate. They were criminals, hiding behind lawyers and corporate structures. I was gathering evidence, Maya, the letter continued. The binders, the maps, it's all here. I was getting close to having enough to take to the federal regulators, to a real journalist. But they started watching me. They knew I was asking questions. I had to protect you. I had to get you away from me, away from here. Pushing you away, letting you believe I was just another drunk who couldn't cope. It was the hardest thing I've ever had to do. It was the only way I could think of to keep you safe, to make sure they wouldn't see you as a threat or as leverage against me. I put you in the system because the system, for all its faults, is a fortress of paperwork. It was the one place I knew they couldn't touch you. I knew it would hurt you. I prayed you would forgive me one day. I had to stop reading. The letter fell from my hands. The small concrete room seemed to tilt. A wave of nausea and a dizzying vertigo washed over me. The entire foundation of my grief, the story of my abandonment, cracked and fell away. He hadn't abandoned me. He had hidden me. His decline, his drinking, the distance he put between us. It wasn't a failure of love, but a desperate, clumsy, and brutal act of it. He had built a wall around me, and the bricks of that wall were my own pain and misunderstanding. The sobs that came now were different from the ones in my apartment. They were born of a grief that was deeper, more complex. I cried for the father I had misjudged. I cried for the lonely, terrifying fight he had undertaken. I cried for the years we'd lost, the years I had spent hating him, just a little, for leaving me. After a long time, I picked up the letter and read the final page. I've left you 2 things, Maya. In a compartment under the workbench, you will find a box. Inside is every dollar I ever saved, and some I acquired. It's enough. Enough for you to go anywhere, start a new life, and never look back. Take it, disappear. Be safe. No one would blame you. That is your first inheritance. But I have left you a second. The evidence, everything in this room, and more in that same compartment. It's probably enough to stop them, to expose them. But fighting them will be dangerous. They are not good people. They will come after you. This is your real inheritance, Maya. Not the land, not the money. The choice. Run and be safe, or stay and fight. I can't make it for you. All I can do is tell you that whatever you choose, I am proud of you. And I have always, always loved you. Your dad. I put the letter down and my hand went to the small cassette recorder. With a shaking finger, I pressed play. The tiny speaker crackled, and then I heard his voice. It was rough, tired, and laced with the static of a cheap recording. But it was him. Maya, little bird, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. If you're hearing this, just listen to the letter, believe it, and know that I love you. The tape clicked off. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. The world had been remade. The story of my life, the one I thought I knew, was a lie. A protective lie, but a lie nonetheless. For 2 years, I had carried the weight of being the daughter of a man who had given up. A man broken by sadness. I had built my identity around that loss, around that abandonment. I was the girl who survived her father's failure. And in the space of 10 pages and 10 seconds of a crackling recording, that identity was annihilated. The grief was immense, a physical force that pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. It was a new kind of grief, sharper than the old one. I was mourning a man I never really knew, a hero, disguised as a failure. The weight of his sacrifice, the sheer loneliness of his fight, was crushing. He had orchestrated his own social ruin to save me. He had let his daughter believe the worst of him so she could be safe. What kind of love is that? A desperate, ferocious, and heartbreaking kind. I sat on that stool in the cold, secret room, and I let the full force of it hit me. I didn't try to be strong. I didn't try to hold it back. I let myself shatter. The choice he had laid out for me felt impossible. Run or fight, safety or justice. My entire being screamed at me to take the money, to run so far away from North Fork and Ridgeback Development that they would never find me. I could go to college. I could travel. I could build a life where I was anonymous, safe, and free from this dark, complicated legacy. It was what any sane person would do. It was what Mr. Evans would advise. It was the logical path. It was the escape I had dreamed of for 2 years. But then there was the other choice. The choice to stay. To pick up the weapon my father had forged and continue his fight. The thought was terrifying. These were not just corporate suits. They were criminals who had built an empire on poison and lies. They had driven my father to his death, either directly or indirectly. What chance did I, an 18-year-old girl with no resources and no allies, have against them? They would crush me. And yet, to take the money and run felt like a betrayal of a different kind. It would mean letting them win. It would mean that my father's sacrifice, his lonely, desperate struggle, was for nothing. They would poison the water. They would destroy this valley. And his last act on earth would be to fund my escape from the consequences. I stumbled out of the shed into the night. The rain had stopped, and the clouds had broken. A sliver of moon cast a pale, watery light over the property. The ruined house, the overgrown fields, the defiant barn. It all looked different now. It wasn't a monument to his failure anymore. It was a battlefield. Every overgrown weed, every sagging board, was a testament to the war he had been fighting in secret. He hadn't been neglecting this place. He had been defending it. I walked the perimeter of the 5 acres, my feet sinking into the wet soil. This land, my land. I felt the truth of his letter in the very ground beneath my feet. The cool, damp air smelled of life, of pine and wet earth. To think of it being poisoned, of this quiet, living place becoming a dead zone, made me feel sick. I thought about the people in the town, the bus driver, the old man on the bus, the families in the houses with the distant lights. They had no idea. They were drinking the water, raising their children, living their lives on the edge of a disaster they couldn't see. My father had seen it, and he had tried to stop it. Have you ever been faced with a choice where both options felt like a kind of death? Where the easy path felt like a betrayal of your soul, and the hard path felt like it could lead to your actual, physical demise? That's where I was, standing in the moonlight, caught between the ghost of my father and the shadow of my future. If you're watching this, and you've ever felt that kind of pressure, that kind of impossible choice weighing you down, I want you to just take a second. Acknowledge that feeling. That's the feeling of being truly alive, of being at a crossroads where your decisions define who you are. This channel is for people who have stood at those crossroads, so if you haven't yet, please subscribe. Join this community, because we're going to get through this story together, and I need to know you're here with me. Now let's get back to that cold night in the foothills. I stood there for hours under the moon, turning the 2 inheritances over and over in my mind. A bag of money and a clean getaway. Or a box of evidence and a righteous war. He had told me to choose, but it didn't feel like a choice. It felt like a test. I slept that night on the floor of the shed, wrapped in my father's coat. It was a cold, hard bed, but I felt safer there, in his secret fortress, than I had in years. I dreamed of him. Not the sad, distant man from the end, but the father from my childhood. We were skipping stones on the river. He handed me a perfect flat stone. "It's all in the wrist, Maya," he said, smiling. I threw it, and it bounced once, twice, 3, 4, 5 times before sinking into the clear water. I woke up just before dawn. The air was cold and crisp. A decision had settled in me, quiet and solid. It wasn't a dramatic bolt of lightning. It was a slow, dawning realization, like the sun rising over the mountains. To run would be to spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder. I would always be the girl who ran. The money would feel dirty, like blood money. My father's sacrifice would haunt me. He didn't die so I could be a wealthy coward. He died trying to give me a choice. And the only choice that honored him, the only choice that allowed me to become someone he would be proud of, was to stay, to fight. My resolve hardened. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was no longer in charge. Determination was. I was no longer just Maya Easton, ward of the state. I was Maya Easton, daughter of David Easton, and I had a job to do. I turned my attention to the workbench. My father's letter had mentioned a compartment beneath it. I knelt on the cold concrete and ran my hands along the underside. My fingers found a small, almost invisible latch. I clicked it, and a section of the floor beneath the bench swung upward on a hidden hinge, revealing a dark, square cavity. I shone my phone's light inside. There were 2 metal ammunition boxes. I lifted the first one out. It was heavy. I opened it, and my breath caught. It was filled with cash. Bundles of 20s, 50s, and 100s, neatly wrapped. It was more money than I had ever seen in my life. This was the escape fund, my father's first inheritance. For a moment, the temptation was overwhelming. The sheer, simple power of that money. The easy way out. I closed the lid. I would need some of it, but not for running. For fighting. I lifted the second box out. It was even heavier than the first. I pried it open. It wasn't money. It was evidence. There were thick folders filled with documents, internal Ridgeback memos, photocopied shipping manifests detailing chemical deliveries, financial records showing the shell game of the debt acquisition. There was a collection of USB drives, and there were photographs. Photos of late-night meetings between the Ridgeback executives and shady-looking men in unmarked trucks. Photos of barrels being unloaded at another property under the cover of darkness. My father had been thorough. He'd been brilliant. This was the weapon. This was a second inheritance. And holding it, I knew I had made the right choice. I wasn't a fool for coming here. I was his daughter, arriving right on time. I took out my phone. The signal was weak, just 1 bar, but it was enough. I scrolled through my contacts and found the number for Mr. Evans. It was barely 7 a.m., but I didn't care. I pressed the call button. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice thick with sleep. "Hello?" "Mr. Evans," I said. My own voice surprised me. It wasn't the timid, uncertain voice of the girl in his office. It was clear, steady, and hard as iron. "It's Maya Easton." "Maya? Is everything all right? Where are you?" "I'm at the property," I said. "And I'm not selling." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could almost hear him sitting up in bed, shaking off the sleep. "Maya, we talked about this. It's not a fight you can win. The debt is fraudulent," I cut in, my voice sharp. "The whole thing is a scam. And I have the proof." The weeks that followed were a blur of focused, relentless activity. Mr. Evans, to his immense credit, didn't dismiss me. My newfound conviction must have been convincing. He drove up from the city the very next day. I met him at the diner in town. I saw the shock on his face when he saw me. I was no longer the lost, fragile girl he'd met in his office. I was dirty, my hair was a mess, and I had a fierce, determined look in my eyes. I didn't show him everything. I didn't tell him about the shed or the full extent of my father's investigation, not yet. But I gave him enough. I gave him the fabricated loan documents and one of the binders detailing the discrepancies in Ridgeback's public filings. He was a legal aid lawyer. used to dealing with landlord disputes and small claims. This was out of his league, and he knew it. But he saw the truth in it. He spent hours looking over the documents in a booth at the back of the diner, a cup of coffee growing cold at his elbow. "My God," he whispered finally, looking up at me, his eyes wide. "If this is what you say it is." He shook his head. "Maya, this is big, and it's dangerous." "I know," I said simply. "Will you help me?" He looked at me, then at the papers, then back at me. He took a deep breath. "I'm not the right lawyer for this, but I know who is." He connected me with a woman named Sarah Jenkins, a semi-retired environmental lawyer who lived one town over. She had a reputation for being a bulldog, for taking on corporate polluters and winning. She agreed to meet me, more as a favor to Mr. Evans than anything else. We met at her small, cluttered office. She was a tall woman in her 60s, with sharp blue eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. I told her the whole story. I told her about my father, the shed, the letter, the evidence. I laid it all out. I expected skepticism. Instead, she listened with an unnerving stillness, her eyes never leaving my face. When I was finished, she was silent for a full minute. "Your father was a brave man," she said, her voice quiet, "and a smart one." She tapped a finger on the ammo box of evidence I'd brought. This is a declaration of war. Are you ready for that?" "I am," I said, and I meant it. She smiled, a thin, rare smile. "All right then, let's go to war." The first step was to use some of the money my father had left to pay off the most immediate property tax arrears, just enough to halt the foreclosure proceedings and buy us time. Sarah filed a flurry of motions, challenging the legitimacy of the debt and demanding a full accounting from Ridgeback. The letters from them stopped being polite offers and became overtly threatening legal notices. They were trying to intimidate me, to bury me in paper. But they weren't just dealing with me anymore. They were dealing with Sarah. While the legal battle began to grind its slow, methodical way forward, I turned my attention to the land itself. I wasn't just defending a piece of property on a map anymore. I was defending my home. I moved out of the cold, sterile shed and into the ruined house. I started with one room, the small bedroom that had been mine as a child. I tore out the molding carpet, scrubbed the floors, and patched the plaster. I used my father's old tools from the barn, which felt strange and right in my hands. The work was hard, physical, and deeply therapeutic. With every nail I hammered, every weed I pulled, I felt like I was reclaiming not just the land, but a piece of myself. The physical transformation of the place mirrored my own internal one. I started clearing the yard. The jungle of weeds and thorns slowly gave way to the good earth beneath. I found the outlines of my mother's old flower beds. I uncovered a stone patio I had completely forgotten. The property was breathing again. The locals in town started to notice. When I went to the general store for supplies, the owner, a gruff man named Hank, started giving me nods, then clipped greetings. One day, he stopped me as I was leaving. "Heard you're fixing up the old Easton place," he said, his eyes appraising me. "I thought Ridgeback was taking that." "I decided not to sell," I said. He grunted. "Good. Never trusted those slick bastards." He handed me a small bag. "Got some extra tomato seedlings. Don't let 'em go to waste." It wasn't much, but it was a start. It was the first hint of a community, of allies beyond my small legal team. I was no longer just an outsider. I was the Easton girl, and I was staying. Months passed. The seasons turned. The initial flurry of legal action settled into a long, drawn-out war of attrition. Ridgeback's lawyers were masters of delay and obfuscation. They filed motions, counter-motions, and endless requests for discovery, trying to bleed us dry of resources and resolve. But Sarah was relentless. And the money my father had left, which I used sparingly and strategically, allowed us to keep fighting. The house slowly began to feel like a home. I had repaired the roof, replaced the broken windows, and gotten the water and electricity turned back on. The front room, once shrouded in white sheets, was now clean and bright, filled with the sturdy, simple furniture my father had built. I had started a small garden where my mother's flower beds used to be. The work was constant, but it was good work. It grounded me. Every morning, I would wake up, make coffee, and sit on the porch I had rebuilt with my own hands, watching the sun rise over the valley. This was my life now. A quiet, determined battle on two fronts, one in the courtroom and one on the land. There were hard days, days when the loneliness was a physical ache, days when a letter from Ridgeback's lawyers would arrive, full of veiled threats and legal jargon, and the fear would creep back in. On those days, I would go to the shed. I would read my father's letter again, or just sit in the quiet, ordered space he had created. It was my sanctuary. It reminded me what I was fighting for. It wasn't just for the land. It was for his memory. It was for the truth. It was for the quiet, unassuming people of this valley who had no idea they were living on the brink of a disaster. One evening, Sarah called me. Her voice was different, tense, excited. "We got a break, Maya," she said. One of their former employees, a geologist, reached out. He quit when he realized what they were really doing. He's willing to talk. He's willing to testify. I felt a surge of adrenaline, of hope so fierce it almost hurt. "What does that mean?" "It means," she said, and I could hear the grim satisfaction in her voice, "that the game is about to change. We can take the evidence to the state attorney general. This is about to go from a civil dispute to a criminal investigation." The end wasn't in sight yet, but for the first time, it felt possible. The path my father had started me on, the hard path, was leading somewhere. Looking back now, I understand what my father meant by my real inheritance. It wasn't the money in the ammo box or the deed to 5 acres of land. It was the choice he gave me. It was the chance to stop being a victim of my circumstances and to become the author of my own story. For years, I was defined by what I had lost. My mother, my father, my home, my childhood. His final gift to me was the opportunity to be defined by what I was willing to fight for. Home, I've learned, is not just a place you are given. It's a place you build. It's a place you defend. The house, the land, it's not just property. It's a repository of memory, a testament to my father's secret love, and a symbol of my own resilience. The scars are still there. The house will always have its ghosts. I will always carry the grief of the years I misunderstood my father. But the wounds are no longer gaping. They are part of the structure now, part of the story that makes this place, and me, whole. My father's letter taught me that some things that look like abandonment are actually a form of protection. Some things that look like failure are acts of quiet heroism. He wasn't a perfect man. His plan was desperate, and it cost us both dearly. But it was born of a love so deep that he was willing to sacrifice his own name, his own memory, to ensure my survival. He gave me the tools to save myself, and in doing so, he gave me the chance to save the home and the community he had died to protect. The legal battle is still ongoing, but the momentum has shifted. The truth is a powerful thing. It moves slowly, but it grinds everything in its path. I don't know what the final outcome will be, but I know that I am not afraid anymore. I am home. And that brings me to you. So many of us are handed stories about our lives that we didn't write. Stories of loss, of failure, of things that were taken from us. We are told who we are by our circumstances. But my story, the one I've shared with you today, is proof that we have a choice. We have the power to find the hidden keys, to unlock the secret rooms in our own history, and to reread the letters we thought we understood. We can choose to be more than just survivors of our past. We can be the defenders of our future. What is the inheritance that has defined you? Maybe it wasn't land or money. Maybe it was a lesson, a burden, a promise, or a choice. I want you to think about that, and I want you to share it in the comments below. Your story matters. The act of telling it, of framing it for yourself, is its own kind of reclamation. If this story resonated with you, if you believe in the power of second chances and the fight for the truth, please subscribe to this channel. Let's build a community here, a place where we honor the hard-fought battles and the quiet heroes. Because sometimes, the most important work we can do is to simply stay and fight.